Welcome to our video. Today we are gonna be talking about fermentation, which is also known as anaerobic respiration. When you perform athletic exercises like running a marathon, your muscle require energy production that's faster than your lungs, and bloodstream can deliver oxygen. Your muscles are forced to work without enough oxygen. In this situation, in order for the body to function properly, it needs energy, and in order to create energy, we breathe and undergo respiration.
Now there are two types of respiration, aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic respiration is respiration involving oxygen, and anaerobic respiration is respiration when oxygen isn't available. Anaerobic respiration is basically the breakdown of glucose to form lactic acid and energy, and aerobic respiration involves the breakdown of glucose with the help of oxygen to create carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Respiration requires oxygen and glucose, and the mitochondria uses them to create ATP, which is basically energy. However, we are going to be focusing on anaerobic respiration, which requires no oxygen. This process is also called fermentation, and we will be using these terms interchangeably.
What makes aerobic respiration different from anaerobic respiration is not only the presence of oxygen, but also the amount of ATP formed. Anaerobic respiration does not form as much ATP as aerobic respiration. In anaerobic respiration, only glucose is broken down and is produced much less ATP than aerobic respiration. However, in human and animal, this process creates lactic acid in the body. In cellular respiration, oxygen accepts electrons at the end of the electron transport chain, where most of the ATP is formed. The ATC is found in cell membrane of the mitochondria. Without oxygen, the electron transport chains stops generating ATP.
So the first step in anaerobic respiration is glycolysis. Glycolysis is followed by a process called oxidative phosphorylation, which we will be talking about later. In glycolysis, which is a key part of the metabolic pathway in the human body system, glucose is converted to pyruvate, ATP, and NADH through a series of intermediate metabolites. To be more specific, glucose is broken down into two pyruvates, and during this process, ADP is turned into ATP and NAD is turned into NADH. After glucose has undergone glycolysis to create two pyruvates, the NADH breaks down pyruvates into lactic acid. After this, the NAD returns to the glycolysis process to break down more glucose and repeat the cycle. This usually occurs in the human body, specifically in the muscles when they don't receive any oxygen. The lactic acid causes the muscles to burn, and that is the reason why your legs tend to burn after you run up a long flight of stairs. Your body isn't able to supply the leg muscles with enough oxygen during this process, so the cells in those muscles undergo glycolysis and lactic acid fermentation, and the formation of lactic acid is what makes the muscles burn. However, the burning sensation goes away after 20 to 40 seconds because your leg muscles are now receiving oxygen, which breaks down the lactic acid. This process is called lactic acid fermentation, and it usually occurs in human beings. However, yeast and plants do not undergo the same process as human muscles, and we will explain why. First of all, glucose and yeast in plants undergo glycolysis just like human muscles do. To remind you of the process of glycolysis, glucose is broken down into two pyruvates, and during this process, ADP is turned into ATP and NAD is turned into NADH. After glucose has undergone glycolysis to create two pyruvates, NADH breaks down the pyruvates into ethanol and CO2. After that, the NAD returns to the glycolysis process to break down more glucose and repeat the cycle. This process is called alcoholic fermentation. Now we are going to explain exactly how this process works inside the mitochondria and what exactly the electron transport chain is. To start off, NADH, which is a reducing agent, brings electrons into the transport system by generating a proton gradient. This proton gradient produces energy, which is later used to make ATP. During glycolysis, glucose is oxidized and NAD and FAD become reduced to NADH and FADH2. From inside the mitochondria, the electrons contained within NADH are transferred to coenzyme Q, which is an electron carrier. This process is completed with the help of NADH dehydrogenase. The protons that pass through the NADH dehydrogenase move to the outside of the membrane. After that, the coenzyme Q moves the electrons over to cytochrome BC1 complex. And as the electrons pass through it and latch onto cytochrome C, more protons are allowed to move from the inside of the membrane to the outside. After that, electrons in FADH2 go through the same process, latching onto coenzyme Q and then letting the protons move through the membrane to the intermembrane area. As you can see, FADH2 has become FAD after losing its electrons. Meanwhile, cytochrome C moves the electrons over to cytochrome C oxidase complex, and this movement allows more protons to exit the cell membrane through the cytochrome C oxidase complex. After that, the electrons in the cytochrome C oxidase complex are transferred to oxygen, which is a terminal electron receptor. As a product of this interaction, water is formed. This entire process of moving protons to the outside of the membrane generates a proton motive force across the membrane of the mitochondria. Since the membrane of the mitochondria is impermeable, it can't let in things like ions, mostly because they're too big. So in order for protons to re-enter the mitochondria, they have to pass through ATP synthase, which is a special proton channel protein. Moving through this protein generates energy, which, as mentioned before, is used to synthesize ATP from ADP and phosphate. This entire process is called oxidative phosphorylation, and it repeats itself in order to create ATP.
In conclusion, cellular respiration is extremely important for the metabolism of a living organism. Cellular respiration basically uses the glucose contained in the foods we eat to create ATP, which is the energy we need to continue living. This process usually involves oxygen, but respiration is still possible without it. Without oxygen, the mitochondria undergoes glycolysis to produce pyruvates, and then it goes through either lactic acid fermentation or alcoholic fermentation, based on what organisms the mitochondria belongs to. This process creates NADH, which are used in the next process, which is called oxidative phosphorylation. One important thing to note is that fermentation itself does not produce ATP. However, it regenerates or recycles NAD+, so that glycolysis can continue. In the end, ATP is formed and the cycle continues. Thank you for watching, and we hope you enjoyed this video. Goodbye.